Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. We are bringing you this episode at a time when there is trouble in India's neighborhood. If we look at Sri Lanka, if we look at Pakistan, even Nepal to some extent, there is political and economic. Actually, there is an economic crisis there which has led to a political turmoil. If we look at Sri Lanka and if we look at Pakistan, we will also look at Biden's Asia visit in this episode of the Ideas Factory. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. Harsh, we would India is really looking with concern what's happening in Sri Lanka. India is trying to do its best in whichever way to help Sri Lanka, but the crisis in Sri Lanka is still at its peak. We've seen that there is a lot of economic distress. Sri Lanka has defaulted on debt. There is acute food shortage. It has, in fact, defaulted on $105 million of the Chinese payment. So, there is a big crisis there, and it has led to a big political turmoil. Of course, there has been a change in leadership. But of course, it is not a very good thing what's happening in India's neighborhood. And India is the last thing India would want is to see a friendly neighbor destabilize. There are security concerns as well. So, do you think the situation in Sri Lanka will stabilize sometime soon? And how do we? What role can India play there? India has been trying to do its best. What else can we expect?
Unprecedented times, I think, Naghma, in especially in Sri Lanka, the kind of economic crisis we have seen, the kind of political turmoil that we have seen in a matter of days. We have seen an entire regime disappear. In fact, an entire dynasty, apart from now the remaining president, just facing oblivion almost. So there is I think there is a real challenge for Sri Lankans and for Sri Lanka's neighbors, in particular for India. I think there is a larger issue here when we talk of our own economies. It is important to recognize that the global economy itself is undergoing tremendous pressure, and so smaller economies that have already had fundamental vulnerabilities are getting exposed. And Sri Lanka, an economy that was relying so much on tourism, facing unprecedented problems after the COVID crisis, find themselves in a situation where they are unable to service their debts, where they are unable to meet the basic obligations as a state, and the result is that you have a bigger crisis. But it must also be pointed out that the management of Sri Lankan economy has also been a problem. The way certain tax concessions were announced by the president when he was running for office, and then the way they were implemented, the way decisions on organic farming were implemented, leading to a fertilizer crisis. I think there has been so much back and forth in terms of decision making that at times you almost felt there was a leadership void in the country. And when people came out on the streets, when people start demonstrating their resentment very, very vocally with the existing regime, it was then that the president realized the enormity of the challenge. And I think it was very late by then. So naturally, you have a situation where his own brother had to go as a prime minister. All the dynasts had to go. The government initially had to be conceived. I think the appointment of Mr. Vikramasinghe as the prime minister has ushered in some level of stability, at least for the time being, that he will be able to manage because of his global personality, because of his engagement with global stakeholders. He'll be able to give some sense of stability to Sri Lanka. But it is a long road ahead, and I think countries like India will have to keep a close eye and help as much as possible. For India, it's not an option; it's an imperative. That India has to step up to the plate as a bigger economy in the region, and I think it has so far it has done its bit, uh, but ultimately it is for the Sri Lankan leadership to demonstrate its commitment to effective economic decision making and to implement certain policy choices on the ground that will ensure that there is long term sustainability to the economic management program. Otherwise, we'll keep on seeing this back and forth, and even at the moment, there is a lot of anger amongst the people, and I think somehow you have to assuage the concerns that one particular dynasty, one particular regime had benefited at the expense of all of ordinary Sri Lankans, and that perception needs to be changed. And I think Mr. Vikramasinghe has a very difficult task ahead, and India certainly should be lending him all the help that is possible.
Could that also be a focus in the upcoming Quad meet? Like you said, India, it's imperative for India to kind of bail out Sri Lanka from this kind of a situation, also because this is a classic example what's happening in Sri Lanka of China's debt trap economy. Now, that's not really good news for Sri Lanka, neither for its neighbors. So, do you think that could be a focus? I mean, China is just the third biggest lender to Sri Lanka after Japan and ADB. So, what's happening there is also a lesson probably for the others around the world, countries in Asia, some islands, also countries in Africa, of how this has led to a trap, the Chinese loans.
Absolutely, and I think China is a very big part of the story. The kind of engagement that China has had with Sri Lanka over the last few years, how it has fueled this crisis to a point where it has become unsustainable, and the kind of debt that Sri Lanka had been kept on belaboring on itself is I think an important reminder to a number of smaller economies around the world that have in the last decade or so relied so much on Chinese largesse that you have to be very careful when you are undertaking certain projects, when you are undertaking certain kinds of engagements, and in particular with China, it is never really clear what is in the contract and how those contracts will be implemented. You would recall that even when the Sirisena government wanted to get rid of China from the Hambantota port, the contract was such that they had to eventually lease out Hambantota on a 99-year lease to China. So I think the challenge is enormous, and there is no, and I think the unfortunate part was for a number of these economies, there was no real alternative. If you have an alternative, you could actually manage China and you could manage China's demands. But because there was no alternative, I think a number of these countries have continued to look at China as the ultimate, aid giver. But now I think that this has been a lesson, and also the fact that countries like India, like other Quad members, or even European Union is getting into the act of providing proper lending, which is transparent, which is about capacity building, which is about ensuring that lending is related to the economic requirements of a particular country and not according to the aims and ambitions of the country of the source. I think there is going to be some change, but it's again for Sri Lanka, it's going to be a long haul. And in this particular case, I think what has also been a bit interesting is that China has been reluctant to help Sri Lanka in restructuring the debt. And I think that has also that also led to a number of problems. Had the initial conversation with China resulted in some concrete deliverables, perhaps the situation would not have come to such a pass. But because China was reluctant initially, and then Sri Lanka had to go to other actors, including the IMF, and China did not like initially that Sri Lanka was going to IMF. I think it created a lot of the imbalance in the way Sri Lankan economy was unable to adjust to the crisis that was brewing underneath, and then suddenly it came out, and the government had to do what it had to do. And I think, therefore, for India, for other like-minded countries in the region, this is an important opportunity to create an alternative, to provide an alternative to some of the smaller nations in the region, and to ensure that the Chinese are not the only game in town.
Sure, China is also a big part of the story. What's happening in Pakistan? There was, of course, economic crisis. There has been leadership change with this political turmoil. The new leadership has a very, very tough challenge ahead. Shahbaz Sharif has to bail out the country from the economic crisis, which is not easy. Also, because what happened during Imran Khan's tenure, they're not in very good relations with the United States there, Harsh. Now, we see a rising anti-China sentiment in Balochistan. Balochistan has been the center, the heart of China's CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But the killings of, or the attacks on the Chinese nationals and the Chinese leaving Pakistan, that has, what does it say? I mean, there is a rising anti-China sentiment, or is also Islamabad's failure to quell that, or there's also an increasing pressure in Pakistan to strike on the BLA camps. So here also China is a very important part of the crisis that is there. And will China now help Pakistan? Does Pakistan have a choice of not really going by what China says?
Well, I don't think Pakistan really has a choice given how far they are in their relationship with China. But I think certainly some of the statements that have come out that suggest that at least rhetorically they are saying that they want to balance relationship with global powers, whether it is China or US or Europe. I think that certainly that sentiment now is being expressed, and Bhutto's visit to US is an important indicator
Yeah.
that I think they are recalibrating in some ways and trying to get into the American fold once again, not making America completely irrelevant to Pakistan's scheme of things. That seems to have happened in the last few years. But I think the challenge there, it remains that Pakistani leadership will not be able to give up on CPEC, and therefore they have not done a good job of convincing the local people in Balochistan, in particular, that this is the corridor or the projects associated with the corridor are for their benefit, and clearly the local population does not recognize the benefits. So I think that communication gap, that and also the fact that they have been pushed by China to undertake certain projects which perhaps a more sensitive government in Pakistan would not have undertaken. So I think there are a host of challenges with CPEC in China on the one hand, and the political challenge that Pakistan is facing, where they are negotiating, even as we speak, in Qatar with IMF for the bailout package, which Imran Khan had signed $6 billion, of which only $3 billion had been dispensed to Pakistan. But Pakistan has not been able to take necessary steps like cutting of subsidies or improving tax collection, etc., which were mandated by that agreement. Now you have a change of government, and but that government is also reluctant to undertake reforms because Imran Khan is on its on the heels of this government, berating this government as one that is operating under outside influence. So I think the political economy of reforms in Pakistan is so complicated at the moment that it doesn't seem that they will be able to uh, manage the long term sustainable enforcement of some of the remedies that are needed to bring the economy back on track. And therefore I think the fundamentals will remain very, very vulnerable of the economy, even as the politics is heating up in Pakistan, has become very polarized, and Imran Khan is leaving no stone unturned in making
Yes.
a comeback. So I think it's a very strange concoction which is almost a tinderbox and can explode anytime.
Yeah, the domestic politics does not allow Shahbaz Sharif probably to take those hard decisions and those reforms that are needed. And like you said, Imran Khan is out there trying to pull down this government. What's happening in one of our, I mean, another neighbor, Nepal? Do you see something similar to Sri Lanka brewing there? Maybe not that dire situation, but there has been a kind of economic crisis, and there have been questions that is Nepal going to go the Sri Lanka way? Uh, it is also brewing a kind of political turmoil, especially against the finance minister who's trying to shift the blame, of course. But we've also had Prime Minister Modi's visit to Lumbini on the occasion of Buddha Purnima, and it was actually it appeared as a successful deployment of India's soft power. Buddha Purnima, the cultural ties that he talked about, visiting Lumbini, is that also an attempt, and was it successful in repairing the Sahar relationship between India and Nepal?
I think to a certain extent, what we have seen under Nepalese Prime Minister Deuba and Modi, that there has been some resetting of the relationship. The relationship had been seeing its ups and downs in the past, but with Mr. Deuba in office, there has been some semblance of stability. Unfortunately, as you were pointing out, the economic dynamic is going in a different direction, and there are economic challenges that Nepal is also facing. Again, it's not entirely evident that this is the same scale as perhaps Sri Lanka or even Pakistan are facing. But certainly for a country like Nepal, the challenges are becoming very difficult to mount. I think Nepalese government is even requesting the expats to help in this crisis by bringing in forex, etc. So I think there is a sense that there is a simmering problem underneath, and that needs to be tackled with some hard decisions. Whether the government has the ability to take those hard decisions, we will see over the next few, I think, days and weeks. But I think Indian Prime Minister's visit to Lumbini was certainly an attempt to reclaim that space, which I think India has always had, but it was seemingly losing to China. We had seen how China had been very, very vocal, even in the Buddhist dynamic of this engagement with Nepal, for a country that calls itself a communist country like China, to take such an interest in Buddhism is quite extraordinary, and the way they have projected their power in and around Lumbini is also, I think, very significant. So, for the Prime Minister to go to Lumbini to make a statement that look, the way India and Nepal are connected culturally, perhaps no other country can take that place, and also link it up with our cultural, historical civilizational ties, whether it is the Ramayana circuit or the Buddhist circuit, is going to be a very important part of our outreach. Because I think ultimately, as we have been discussing, China has many more levers, but India's, specifically when you talk of Nepal, India has that important lever of people to people connectivity that I think allows us a certain amount of receptivity in Nepal. Though certainly the concerns of the 21st century should be embedded in our relationship, and we should be looking at the relationship much more through contemporary prism. But the soft power that both countries share and both countries can enrich each other should not be underestimated. And I think that was the message of the Prime Minister's visit.
Sure, and another interesting offer, Harsh, has come from Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina has offered the Chittagong port for its services. What does Sheikh Hasina's offer really mean, considering Chittagong is really important strategically for India's northeast, for China as well, because it's like China's foothold in the Indian Ocean. So, there a good situation definitely for India. What would it really mean, and does that upset China?
I think to a certain extent, that would, that statement or that offer would have taken China by surprise. And I think what Sheikh Hasina is now looking at is the potential of using this port for connecting Bangladesh to India's northeast, which is, I think, a very, very sensible priority both for India and for Sri Lanka, and for a long time had been at the heart of India's engagement with Bangladesh. That as we look towards our east, our northeast has to be the bridge that connects India to its
Sure.
eastern partners
Mhm.
and all the way to Southeast Asia and East Asia. And I think if that happens, then it's going to be a win-win for both. And I think Sheikh Hasina's offer is in line with that sentiment, and a very important message has gone out that or Bangladesh remains very much in favor of undertaking that project. And I think India will be taking that up, and India should be taking that up with utmost, persistence and urgency, because that's a very critical element of India's
Yeah.
Eastern strategy, look
Yeah.
East, act East strategy. But
Yes.
I think I would just like to broadly point out that if you look at the events in the last few weeks and months in terms of South Asia, there has often been this lament that look, India is losing in South Asia, that China is so much powerful. I think what we see is a much more fluid situation. What we see is at the moment, especially if you look at what is happening in the neighborhood and how India is positioned, actually you have good stories to tell about India. India and Sri Lanka, one of emerging as a most important responder in a time of crisis. India and Nepal strengthening their relationship. India and Bangladesh, of course, going from strength to strength. So I think by and large, India is well positioned to look at the neighborhood and be relatively satisfied with as the way things are going. But the larger point here is that this contestation between India and China, and the ability of smaller neighbors of India to use this as a balancing device is going to continue. Sometimes
Mhm.
India will be, in a privileged position, sometimes China. But ultimately, the agency lies with the smaller states and how they perceive India and China's role. So the more they perceive India as a reliable country, as a reliable neighbor, I think the better it is for India, and the better alternatives India can offer, more credible alternatives India can offer to its neighbors, that will enhance India's engagement with its neighbors, as we have seen over the last few months.
And India has probably lived up to its neighbors' expectations so far, or whatever is happening around in the area. A quick comment, Harsh. I would like to add to this question: why this offer from Bangladesh now? I mean, is this also, do you see it as this as a diplomacy of balance by Sheikh Hasina? this offer of Chittagong port? Why now?
Indeed. I think this has been, if you would recall, Chittagong was seen as part of wider Chinese encirclement of India, and that if Chinese enter there, they would be very well positioned in the Bay of Bengal, and those sorts of questions were being raised. And I think with this decision, Sheikh Hasina has marginalized that argument and made it very clear that she has no intention of going all the way in one particular direction. And I think while China continues to remain a very important partner for Bangladesh, she clearly recognizes that the long term future for Bangladesh's economy, which, by the way, is doing exceptionally well at the moment, is linked with India's northeast. So I think she has made it very clear that she believes in creating this balance intact.
Yes, yes, and I mean, I know there is very little time left now on this episode, but a very important, trip by President Biden to Asia. He's already arrived in South Korea, and there is, of course, the Quad will take place. There is also talk of an Indo-Pacific Economic Forum there. This is his first trip to Asia after his presidency, and this is happening at a time when, of course, there is the rise of China and all that, but there is also that Ukraine-Russia crisis, which is looming large, but the focus seems to be on boosting the Indo-Pacific, the relations in this area.
Yes, I think an important message, perhaps, by Washington that even as the focus has been entirely on Ukraine and on Europe for the last few months, Washington does not intend to leave Indo-Pacific alone. Washington is invested in the Indo-Pacific. Biden administration is invested in the Indo-Pacific, and I think gradually they have stepped up their engagement. Secretary of State Blinken was in Southeast Asia a few weeks back, and now Mr. Biden's trip to two of the closest partners that America has in the region, South Korea and Japan, and of course participating in the Quad, which has emerged as the central focal platform in the region. So clearly, I think a message to China, to American allies in the region, to American partners in the region, that Indo-Pacific remains at the heart of American strategy, there is an attempt to shore up the partners and allies in the region. So I think that we are going to see some interesting conversations, and of course the meeting of the Quad next week.
Yeah, trade ties and Indo-Pacific Economic Forum and supply chains, reliability of the supply chains, all that is probably on the agenda. So thank you so much, Harsh, for this analysis. And that's all from us on this episode of the Ideas Factory. See you next week.